I'm going to talk to you about a precise 1/4-inch seam. The skill of making a precise 1/4-inch seam is one of the best skills that you can work on to make your piecing more accurate. So first of all, I have a number of samples here that I had some fun with making some mistakes, and I want to take a look at them and talk about how to avoid these mistakes. So first of all, I'm going to start with this one. And I want you to look at it closely and tell me what it is that you see about this one that would be considered a mistake. Okay, you've had a chance to look at it, so now I want you to notice that up here, the two edges don't match up. And when we open this up, you will see that we've got a jagged edge right here. And a jagged edge is going to have a little bit of trouble matching up to the next piece. So that imprecision right there is going to make the next seam even more imprecise. So we'd like to avoid that. Now, first of all, what causes this? Well, first of all, I'm going to assume that you know how to line up the fabric, because if you don't line it up to start with, this could be a cause of that. But secondly, even if you do line up the fabric and you stick your fabric in under your presser foot and you start sewing with the presser foot out here, and you just start sewing, what can happen is that the feed dogs can grab the lower piece and the foot can press the top piece this way. So instead of doing that, I recommend that you pick up your foot every time you start a new piece. You pick up your foot, you move it in, you put both of your pieces of fabric right up tight to the needle so that when you take the very first stitch, it goes through both layers of fabric. And that will avoid this problem right here. Okay, here's another one. Take a little bit of time and look at that one. Now I'm sure that you see that right up here there's a jagged edge. It veered off, and it probably happened where you were sewing along just fine and all of a sudden you get to the end and you go off, and that happens typically because you let go. And when you're sewing along, you should be holding on to these edges, keeping them even, sewing along. But when you get to the end and your finger's getting very close to that needle, it's not uncommon for you to want to let go, and then the feed dogs can take it a funny direction. And don't ever let go completely of your fabric. So if it's getting too close here to hold on to the needle, keep a hold of it off to the side, keep a hold of it on the back, but never let go and never stop guiding it through all the way to the last stitch when it comes off of the last stitch comes off of the fabric. Okay, here's another one. And as you look at this one closely, you will notice that it's pretty wavy. And what causes that? Well, as you're sewing along and you're holding on down here, this hand is guiding the seam. So if you go this way, it makes the seam smaller. If you go that way, it makes the seam bigger. And if you see wobbles in it, then you know that your hand has gone back and forth like this. It's like you're wiggling around on the highway as you're driving, moving the wheel back and forth. So what you want to try to do is keep it very steady as it's moving through. Hold on down here and try not to go back and forth. If you have to make small corrections, make them very tiny so that you don't end up with those wobbly seams. Okay. What about this one? You probably noticed, and it's pretty fine, this distinction here, that it's narrower on this end than it is on this end. And perhaps you started off at a 1/4 inch and you missed your line as you were going down, or perhaps you started at a 1/4 inch up here and you started getting wider and missed your line. Now you are going to have to figure out with your particular sewing machine how to get a 1/4 inch seam. Some sewing machines come with a special foot. Some sewing machines come with a special setting. Some have markings on the throat plate that you can follow. But figure it out what it is with your machine, how it's set up to get that 1/4 inch setting. With mine, I have a 1/4 inch setting, and I use my regular foot, and I just need to make sure that the edge of my foot is always riding right next to the edge of my fabric. When I'm sewing, I'm not looking at my needle. In fact, it kind of gives a little bit of a strobe effect if you do look at the needle and it's not the best. I am looking over here at the edge of the fabric and the edge of the foot and making sure that they stay even, and then you can avoid this right here. Okay, this one. What do you think is wrong with this one? And if you looked right here and noticed that the two edges of the fabric are not not even right here, they should be tied up together, but they're not. That's correct. And what probably happened to make that is you're sewing along this way and the bottom fabric is getting skewed away from the top fabric and you don't realize it. So while you're sewing again, first of all, you line it up and you get started. Stop and make sure that everything is still lined up, and reline it up, and never let go until you get to the very end, keeping those two edges even all of the way. Okay, here's another one. And this one might not be so obvious for you to see. And the problem with this one is that the seam is not a 1/4 inch. It's too wide. And I'm going to put this on so that you can see. I'm going to set one of these lines on my ruler so that it's just next to the seam line. And then you can see that this over here is way past a 1/4 inch. Now, you say it's not really way past. It's only about a 1/16 of an inch farther. But when we open this up, a 1/16 of an inch has become an 1/8 of an inch because it happened to both pieces. So I'm going to line this up over here. And this one should have come out to be at this mark over here. And as you can see, it did not make it. It's now an 1/8 of an inch away. So one of the things that I like to say is that mistakes multiply. And something that starts out very small, 1/16 of an inch here, turns into an 1/8 of an inch here. If we sew another piece on the same way, it's going to be now a 1/4 of an inch off. And you can see that that mistake grows very rapidly. So we want a very accurate 1/4 inch seam. So this one is the one that is as it should be. This is a good 1/4 inch seam, and I'm going to show you how it's good in two different ways. First of all, I'm going to set my ruler on here. And I put a line right next to the seam line so I can measure the exact seam here. And you can see that it is on the 1/4 inch line over here, the edge of the fabric is. An even better way to check is to actually open it up and measure it. And I'm going to put it on the 0 line down here. And this should come out to be right at 4 inches. Scoot it over just a skosh, and you can see that it goes from 0 to 4. That's exactly as it should be, and our 1/4 inch seam is where we want it to be. So now when I continue to sew more pieces on, my accuracy is going to stay the same, and the final piece is going to end up to be the size that the quilt designer designed the quilt to be. And that means that if I piece some pieces together and have to sew them to another section, those sections are going to match, which is what I want to have happen. I have an assignment that I would like for you to do to test to see how your 1/4 inch seams are. And that is that I'd like you to cut 4 2.5 inch squares of fabric out of some scraps. And then I want you to sew them together end to end, like this. And then I want you to measure it. Now, if they start 2.5 inches, that means that after I take off the 1/4 inch seams here, these two pieces in the middle are 2 inches. Here I have 2 inches plus a seam allowance on both edges. So this should be 8.5 inches. So first of all, I'm going to finger press. And then I'm going to measure. And this is exactly what I want you to do too. Oops. Put the ruler right on top and it should measure 8 inches. 8.5, I mean, and it does. So that is an indication that my seam allowances are very nice. Now, what if your piece ends up to be bigger than 8.5 inches? Well, that's an indication that your seams are too small, so go back and work on fine-tuning those seams. If you find out that your piece is smaller than 8.5 inches, your seams are too large, and again, go back and work on it. And I would suggest to you that you keep practicing on scrap fabrics like this until you consistently and confidently get 1/4 inch seams.